right? Anyway, let me talk about Deuteronomy 32. Now, I'm with Charles. I really haven't taken a position on Psalm 82, John 10. But I will be honest and say, I lean more towards the human judge's view in John 10. And I think Charles does too, right? Whereas I lean more towards the Heavenly Council view in Psalm 82. I know I'm weird, but I'll tell you my reasons why I'm not fully persuaded by Mike Heiser's arguments. He may have addressed this passage. I'm looking for it, right? I'm looking for it, but I haven't found it. I'm going to give you my reasons why, even though the Bible refers to gods, I do not think that the Bible is identifying them as actual divine beings of a lesser kind, right? I do not think. Now, again, like I said, I'm open, and I've heard Mike Heiser, and I've heard his arguments, and at the surface, they were quite convincing until I dug a little deeper, and I'm not fully persuaded. Now, Charles is here, and you can tell me where you think I'm wrong. Let me show you why Deuteronomy 32:8, even in his preferred reading, doesn't support his view. Are you ready? Mike Heiser, part of his argument for a divine council, a council of divine beings, spiritual beings who are gods of a lesser sort, part of the argument stems from the reading found in Deuteronomy 32:8, a reading found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Greek version of the Old Testament, at least many, if not most, of the copies of the Greek version, right? Deuteronomy 32:8. So are you guys ready, Jai? I want you to hear this because it's going to help you. Someone posts for me Deuteronomy 32:8 in the English Standard Version or in the New Revised Standard Version. English Standard Version or New Revised Standard Version. Okay? Because the King James goes off of the later Hebrew manuscripts known as the Masoretic text type. And these copies all come after the time of Christ, right? Someone posts for me Deuteronomy 32:8 and ESV. And probably I'm going to have to call it a night. Let's see. Okay, now pay attention to this reading. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. This reading is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's older, so it's older than the later Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament that were copied by the Masoretes, these Jewish scribes. These copies that we have are from a period after the time of Christ, whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls are older than Christ. So this reading, sons of God, is an older reading than that found in the later manuscripts of the Old Testament produced after the time of Christ, known as the Masoretic text type. In order for you to understand my point, not confuse you, let's see how the King James Version reads, because it's based on the later Masoretic text type. King James Version of Deuteronomy 32:8. Let me know if I'm making sense to all of you, right? Because I'm speaking off the cuff right now, trusting the Spirit to guide me to speak clearly without error. Now notice the reading in the King James, which is based on the later Masoretic textual tradition of the Old Testament. Copies of the Hebrew Bible produced by a group of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes, but these copies were all produced after the time of Christ. Notice the reading here. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of God, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Do you see the difference? English Standard Version goes with the reading found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is older than the reading found in the King James. Everyone with me there? In the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says that God divided the nations according to the sons of God. In the King James Version, based on the later textual witnesses to the Old Testament, it says God divided the nations according to the sons of Israel. Do you guys see the difference? Did God divide the nations according to the number of the sons of God, or did God divide the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel? That's the debate. Well, Mike Heiser and others prefer the Dead Sea Scrolls rendering here because it's older And this copy of the Old Testament was written before the time of Christ. And then you have the Greek version supporting it. In the Greek version, or the extant copies of the Greek version of the Old Testament, most of the copies read angels of God, and some actually read sons of God, right? So when you take the witness of the Greek version of the Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls, it seems that Moses originally wrote, God divided the nations according to the sons of God, which the Greek version takes to be a reference to the angels. Is everyone with me? The Greek version is a witness to this older reading, sons of God. And the Jewish scribes who translated that reading into Greek understood the sons of God to be the angels. Understood the sons of God to be the angels. That's how they understood that phrase. That here, God divided the nations according to the number of the angelic hosts. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that God assigned the nations to the rulership of these angelic beings. He gave permission to these angelic sons, these angelic creatures, to rule over the nations. That's what this reading would mean as attested by the Greek version. Everyone with me there, or am I confusing you? If I'm confusing you, put a 2. Okay. So far, everyone, and now I'm preaching to the choir with Charles, so he knows this. However, if we go with the rendering in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not the interpretation by the Jewish scribes who translated the Hebrew into the Greek. Remember, the Greek version doesn't always give you a literal translation. What you find in the Greek version is a commentary of sorts in which the Jewish scribes tell you what they think the passage means. So at times when you read the Greek version of the Old Testament, you're not getting a literal translation, you're getting more of a paraphrase in which the scribe or scribes are telling you what they think the text means. You with me there? Before I move on to the next point? That means just because the Greek versions read angels of God or sons of God, that doesn't mean that's the actual meaning when it was originally penned by Moses under inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That simply tells us that's how these Jews understood it. Now, they can be right, they can be wrong. You with me there? They can be right or they can be wrong. Okay. So I'm going to put the Greek version aside. I'm going to assume that Moses wrote Son of God. However, even with that assumption, it still doesn't prove Mike Heiser's point. Even the reading Sons of God doesn't mean that the nations were divided and handed over to these angelic beings to rule over them. Because I'm going to show you contextually that you can make a strong case that the sons of God is a reference to Israel, God's chosen people. So that the later reading of the Masoretes, God divided the nations according to sons of Israel, is correct. Because sons of God in the context is a reference to the children of Israel as God's covenant community. Are you ready now for the evidence? What evidence do I have to show that the sons of God reading doesn't necessarily point to angels, but can be a reference to God's covenant community? Are you ready for the evidence? I'm going to use Deuteronomy to prove my case. Deuteronomy 32 verse 6. Let's start there. Charles, tell me what you think if I'm weak here. Deuteronomy 32:6. Here is the link to the interlinear. Oh, darn it. Here's the link to the interlinear. Okay. Do ye thus requite the Lord, O foolish people and unwise? Is not he thy father that hath bought thee? Who is Jehovah to his people? Now that word bought is the verb kana. Kana also can mean give birth to or create. I didn't post the link yet. Hold on. Here it goes. So another way of rendering it is he not your father who begot you, gave birth to you? So in Deuteronomy 32:6, Israel's called God's children. He's their father. And notice verse 6 precedes verse 8. So contextually, you can make a case that the sons of God in verse 8 are God's covenant people, Israel, because in verse 6, we've been already told God is their father and he gave birth to them. Right? That's the first argument. Is that clear? Does everyone see it? Is he not your father who begot you? The verb is qana. It can mean possess or buy, but it can also mean produced you, gave birth to you, created you. And contextually, the verb should be rendered as God giving birth to them because it's used in the context of God being identified as their father who begot them. But there's more. Let's look at Deuteronomy 32:18. It's Deuteronomy 32:18 to 20, but we're going to take it one verse at a time. Deuteronomy 32:18. Watch here. Watch what it says here. Deuteronomy 32:18. Let me get this, hold on. Okay. Of the rock that begot thee. Did you catch it? God the rock begot you. Thou art unmindful. And has forgotten God that formed thee. Now, I'm going to give you the link to the interlinear. Okay? Okay? That word form can also be rendered as gave birth to you. So, Yahweh is the God, the rock, that gave birth to Israel. That birthed Israel. Right? So again, he's being described as a father. In fact, here, he's described as a mother who gives birth to her offspring. You catch it here? But wait, notice verse 19. Deuteronomy 32:19. And when the Lord saw it, he abhorred them because of the provoking of his sons and his daughters. Bam! Here you go. Israel is called the children of God, his sons and daughters. Right? Beni and Benat. You catch it? So, Israel is the son of God. The Israelites are the sons and daughters of God. The Israelites are God's children whom God gave birth to, whom God begot spiritually. But wait, notice verse 20. And I'm giving you the link so you can see that this is what the text is saying. The verbs clearly are verbs used for birthing, giving birth, right? And the words clearly refer to sons and daughters. What about verse 20? Catch here. Sorry I'm loud. I'm just loud by nature because I'm angry. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are very froward generation, children in whom is no faith. Wait. Israel is called what? Children. Whose children? God's children. And the word is banim. Banim. They are God's children. God's sons and daughters whom he spiritually birthed. Okay, now, contextually, what argument could someone muster to rule out the fact that the sons of God reading in the context of Deuteronomy 32 isn't a reference to angels, but to the Israelites? That God divided the nations in anticipation of, in view of, Israel, his people, whom he'd eventually form for his glory. Contextually, how do you refute it? Now let's Deuteronomy 14:1. Now, how are you going to refute it contextually? Deuteronomy 14:1. I'm going to give you the link. Ye are the children of the Lord your God. End of story. You can also render it as sons of the Lord your God. Ye are the children, sons of the Lord your God. Ye shall not cut yourselves, right? Nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. So my question to every one of you again. Since in Deuteronomy 32 verse 6, 18 to 20, and 14 verse 1, we are told that Israel is the nation that God spiritually birthed, gave birth to, begot, and that the Israelites are the sons and daughters of God, the sons of the Lord God. What contextual argument could someone give me to conclusively prove that the sons of God reading in Deuteronomy 32:8 is a reference to angels as opposed to the nation? What argument could you give me to refute the point? Especially when nowhere in that chapter or in Deuteronomy as a whole do you find angels called sons of God. There are references to gods in Deuteronomy 32, but these gods are called demons, and God condemns the Israelites for worshiping them. But what can you show me from the context of Deuteronomy 32 or Deuteronomy as a whole, or even Exodus to Deuteronomy, apart from Genesis 6, that sons of God refer to angelic beings as opposed to the Israelites? Now, Charles, do you see any holes in my argumentation? Or do you think I have a strong contextual case? If you want to take the mic, let me know. Put a 1. So Mike Heiser's, go ahead, take the mic. Mike Heiser's case is not as strong as it appears. Go ahead, Charles, your mic.
Yeah, I just want to point out something that I think goes together with that beautifully. Remember that if you go back into the prior chapter, Deuteronomy 31, we're told that this was a song given to Moses, and he was to teach the people of Israel this song in light of their future apostasy. Now, I don't know about you, but the whole idea there is kind of chilling. Just imagine a hymn that you sing in church that's all about your future apostasy from the Lord and the consequent judgment. But here's why that's significant. In the prior chapter, it says that you're to teach this song. It'll be a testimony or a witness against you in the latter days. Okay, remember that phrase, the latter days, right? When we come to the New Testament, it repeatedly tells us that Christ has appeared once at the end of the ages, or in the latter days, or the last days, right? At least in some cases, it's referring to the last days of the Old Covenant. Right? In Hebrews 1, it says that in the past God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us through his Son. So that's a phrase that points to the time of the Messiah, right? When the Messiah would come and fulfill the Old Covenant and inaugurate a new covenant. Well, so the reason I find this significant is the Jews, well, they're not only told to read this song once every 7 years together with the entire Torah, but we know from various sources that they actually sang this song in the temple together with Exodus 15, the song of, oh, I'm sorry, I was reading the comment here, but and we're told that during the Feast of Tabernacles, this song, as well as the song about the redemption from Egypt in Exodus 15, would be sung by the temple, at the temple, right? Exodus 15 would be, oh, not you, Charles, okay. Exodus 15 would be sung in the morning, and Deuteronomy 32 would be sung in the evening. Now, here's why I think that's significant to the whole discussion of Psalm 82 and John 10. If you go back to John's Gospel and you start reading from chapter 7 all the way up through chapter 10, you'll see that the occasion on which all of this is taking place is the Feast of Tabernacles, the very time when this song would have been sung at the temple. Now, in John 10, verse 22, it says the Feast of Dedication, which comes after or later than the Tabernacles. However, it's joined there by John with the prior feast because the Jews considered it something like a second Tabernacles. In fact, that was one of the names by which they referred to it. So the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, was considered a second tabernacle, and the way they would have celebrated it is the same way they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, I bring all this up as significant because notice what it says in 32:39. In 32:39, the Lord says, "See now that I am, and there is no God besides me. It is I who put to death and give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal. And there's no one who can deliver from my hand or take you out of my hand." Now, what does that last phrase sound like? There's no one who can deliver you from my hand. It sounds exactly like what Jesus said in John 10, right? Just prior to the discussion that takes place in 10:22. Now, notice as well what it says in verse 39. It says, "See now that I am," the English version adds the word he, and there's no God besides me. Literally what it says is, in Hebrew is Ani Hu, which means I am. This is translated in the Greek Septuagint, it's I am. Right? See now that I am, ego eimi, there's no God besides me. When Jesus uttered that phrase in John 8, right, it was in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles, when the Jews would have heard this song coming from the temple, and they would have heard these words that were quoted, that are a quotation of the Lord's own self-identification, right? I am. So the Jews knew what that phrase meant, and when Jesus uttered it, they understood it to be a claim to be God, and therefore, since they didn't believe Jesus was God, they accused him of blasphemy. But now, what does it say that Jesus did when they picked up stones to stone him? It tells us that he hid his face from them, and he went out of the temple, right? But did you hear what it says in Psalm 32? Right? In verse 20 it says, "Then he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are a perverse generation, sons in whom there is no faithfulness." Okay? Again, this is a song that was to be taught to Israel, that Israel was to sing, to learn and sing, and it would be a testimony to them in the latter days in the face of their apostasy. Yahweh in this psalm that was sung at the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the very context in which Jesus is confronting the religious leaders in John 8 and John 10, in that very context of Psalm 32, Yahweh declares himself to be the I am and says he'll turn his face or hide his face from that evil generation, which is the very thing Jesus does in John 8 as well as John 10, right? He hides his face from them and slips out of their midst. So anyways, I think this ties in fully with all of what Sam has been saying, and the point I was trying to make earlier about how the religious leaders are being treated as corrupt judges who were supposed to defend the poor and the fatherless and so forth, but instead were guilty of making unjust judgments, even against the Lord himself. But I also don't think that negates the other point that Sam has made. I don't know if he's made that here yet, but the idea that there is a spiritual background to that conflict that ties in with Psalm 82. So anyways, I'll relinquish the mic.
Yeah, by the way, just to make it clear, I'm not denying the existence of a heavenly council. My point in Deuteronomy 32 was simply to show that Mike Heiser's argument is not as solid, as strong as one may think. That doesn't mean he's wrong. The sons of God in Deuteronomy 32:8 can be the heavenly council. You get my point? It can still be a reference to angelic beings. What I'm saying is the arguments he uses to make his case, they're not as strong as they appear at first glance, correct? So that's what I'm saying. So sons of God, someone can say contextually that's referring to the nation. Now, how do you refute that contextually? Well, if you just go by the chapter, I don't see any way you can refute it, right? The only way you can refute that is by appealing to the Greek version, by saying, well, the Jewish scribes that rendered Deuteronomy into Greek understood the sons of God to refer to angelic beings. But then that would assume that these Jewish scribes always got the context correct. They always understood the context correctly. But you know why that's another problem for Mike Heiser's position? You guys understand why that's a problem? Appealing to the Septuagint doesn't help Mike Heiser. It actually provides further refutation of his position, because the majority of the Greek versions, extant Greek versions on Deuteronomy 32:8, render sons of God as angels of God. Do you know why that's a damning interpretation from Mike Heiser's view? Does anyone know why that actually refutes Mike Heiser's view? Anyone have an idea? Because Mike Heiser doesn't believe the sons of God are the angels. He believes that the sons of God are different from the angels. The angels are the messengers of the sons of God. They're not the same. But the Jewish scribes identified the sons of God as the angels. You see the point? Do you guys know this? I know you knew that, right, Charles? You knew that he believes there's like a three-tier structure in the divine council. You have Yahweh, the sons of, and the heavenly messengers. Well, the Jewish scribes identified the sons of God as the angels. So to them, they're one and the same. They're not distinct. So if you appeal to the Greek version, it proves too much. It proves he's wrong. You get my point, Charles? So overall, could you think of a way in which what I just presented could be refuted contextually? That someone can legitimately say the sons of God refers to Israel in its context. Exactly, Charles. Right? Can you think of a good argument against that position, Charles? Because you get a fabulous exegesis of Deuteronomy 32 and how it points to the deity of Christ. Right? The first part of your response, I didn't hear. You may have addressed it because there was a, believe it or not, guys, as Charles was speaking, a oneness heretic knocked on the door because I'm at this church. It's a storefront that functions as a church. Knocked at the door and was trying to tell me I don't believe in the Trinity. As Charles was speaking, I asked him certain questions. He ran out. He goes, I got to go. I go, where are you running from? Why are you running, man? Here, let me cure you of your heresy because your Jesus is going to damn you to hell. Repent. And he took off. He just took off. So anyway, so now, Jay, you see how Mike Heiser's case is not as strong as it first appears, right? Just follow the context of Deuteronomy 32. Look at 6. Look at verses 18 and 20, then 14:1, and you can make a strong case. Even the sons of God reading refers to the Israelites. That God divided the nations in view of the nation of Israel that he knew he was going to form for his glory. And so all he did in time and space was directed to that purpose, right? There's one passage, I'm going to end it with this, unless Charles wants to take the mic afterwards. There's one passage that causes me pause, right, in fully embracing Mike Heiser's view. And you know what passage that is? It's Galatians 4, verse 8. Galatians 4, verse 8. Let's look at it. This passage, yeah, you see, Charles? Because it says, they are not gods by nature. Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them, talking to the Gentiles, you were serving those who by nature are no gods. So if we take Mike Heiser's position, the nations were worshiping the sons of God. But Paul says those gods that you were serving are not gods by nature. So they're not gods at all. So how can they be gods of a lesser sense? You see the point? This passage has caused me from fully embracing Heiser's view. Because I don't know how you get around this passage. You see that, Jay? How do you get around the fact that here, what the Gentiles were worshiping, which according to Heiser would be the divine beings of the heavenly host, the sons of God, divine council. This passage says that which they were worshiping are not gods by nature. They're not gods at all. So then, how then do you reconcile this with Heiser's view? They are gods, albeit in a lesser sense, in contrast to Yahweh, in contrast to Jehovah.